Не е нужно да прекарате часове сред природата, за да изпитате ползотворния ефект от връзката си с нея. Ambience TV е създадена за това. Телевизионният канал ви улеснява да насочите вниманието си към красотата на природата и да се отпуснете за кратко, за да се освободите от стреса, преди да продължите с деня си. Търсете Ambience TV в YouTube.
Hello, dear friends in Bulgaria and all over the world, and welcome. You are watching the TV show Visible and Invisible, Counter-Propaganda. I'm SVET DI-NAHUM. Russian attack against world democracies continues. It goes hand in hand with the Kremlin's genocidal war against Ukraine. Russian hybrid and disinformation operations are based on the political and economic corruption existing in the same countries in the free world that are targeted by Putin's regime. What is the way to win this battle? What is the correlation between collaboration with autocrats, corruption, and the dysfunctions of the democratic systems? Do we need a significant improvement of the existing security mechanism in Europe? Today, I have the high honor to talk to a famous global security expert on these issues. Mr. Paul Massaro is the Senior Policy Advisor for Counter-Corruption and Sanctions at the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the U.S. Helsinki Commission. His work on the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act has for the first time provided justice to clean athletes and held to account the authoritarian actors who use sport as a tool of foreign policy. His work on the Transnational Repression, Accountability and Prevention Act was similarly groundbreaking, serving as the first ever US law to respond to abuse of Interpol by authoritarian regimes. Paul is regularly quoted and published by major media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and Foreign Policy. Paul is an alumnus of the National Endowment for Democracy Penn Campbell Fellowship and the Robertson Foundation for Government Fellowship. Welcome, Paul.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Paul, you have huge experience in the think tank sector. Do you think the West has been naive to appoint so many Russians at different think tanks who later took a quite conformist position regarding the war against Ukraine?
Well, of course, it's not just Russians at think tanks. It's kind of like the Russia friendlies, right? I mean, I think that what you were pointing out in your introduction there is very accurate, that kind of the corruption in our own societies and kind of the openness to foreign money in our own society set us up for failure. Again, I don't think there are certainly Russians at the think tanks that fall into this category, but there are also people at think tanks that were taking Russian money, perhaps behind the scenes, perhaps via some kind of intermediary, perhaps going to Valdai regularly, perhaps they enjoyed being wined and dined in Moscow and so on and so forth. But Russia, you know, this was a campaign by Russia. This was a very organized, well-organized, well-designed campaign to control the narrative of how Russia and the region were discussed so that it reflected Moscow's perspective.
I see, and I really like your point about Valdai goers who quite differently change their stances, and I typically don't trust such people. Do you think Russia will be successful to destabilize the Balkans again? How clear is the U.S. response to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's very difficult to say. I think it is noteworthy that Russia still has as much influence in the Balkans as it does, because one would think that given how Russia is waging this genocidal war against Ukraine, how Russia is destabilizing the entire region, how this all obviously comes back to Russia, one would think at this point that the talking points of those pro-Russian groups would be delegitimized, that the kind of power would be negated. However, it's not. So, I mean, I think it goes to show you just how deeply ingrained a lot of these transnational corruption networks and disinformation networks are. So I think we shouldn't, we shouldn't underestimate Russia's ability to fight in the information space. Now, in the military space, they've shown themselves to be much, much weaker than I think anyone had anticipated, but that's just not the case in the info world. In the info world, Russia remains, strangely, even when we have, videos, endless videos of their atrocities and evils they're perpetrating in Ukraine, still remains powerful in the information space.
That's right. Recently, we all see the tensions in Kosovo, for example. Also, there are such news from Bosnia. Recently, Moscow held a conference which was called something like Peace and Security Conference, and special guests there were like the head of Serbian Special Services, also the leader of Bosnian Serbs. So do you think there will be something concrete on behalf of Russia in the former Yugoslavia region?
I don't think it's ever very concrete with Russia. I think Russia, their info strategy, their corruption strategy is more about asymmetrically poking, causing chaos, figuring out where the weak points are. I don't actually think there's kind of a grand buildup behind it to the point of like, okay, we'd like to see this. They'd like to see destabilization. They'd like to see chaos. I think that is the Russian foreign policy goal. The more they can break down institutions, destroy trust in institutions, destroy trust between people, destroy trust within democracies, the happier they are. But that's the extent of the goal. That is to say, they will continue to poke, they will continue to prod, they will continue to push their corruption in, they will continue to push their talking points in, they will try to get their money in anybody's pocket that'll take it. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's a grand overarching kind of strategy here from Russia, beyond cause as much chaos as possible.
Russian hybrid and disinformation operations are based on the political and economic corruption existing in the same countries in the free world that are targeted by Putin's regime. What is the correlation between collaboration with autocrats, corruption, and the dysfunctions of the democratic systems? Well,
that's what kind of leaves us open to it, right? I've described it before as our financial defenses, but it's also our info defenses. We're open societies. Russia takes advantage of this. Russia tries to co-opt elites, influencers, whoever they can to get their, talking points across. I think they've actually been very successful beyond, we're focusing on the Balkans here, but even beyond the Balkans, right? They've been very effective even in societies that you'd think should have been more resilient to this sort of thing. They've been very effective in the United States even. I think that Russia's kind of almost free market of disinformation approach, where they just kind of like, here's for some intelligence agency or for some individual or for some, we've been calling them vatniks, these people that have willingly almost pushed Russian talking points. They try to find them. They try to give them some money. They try to amplify them. It's a very kind of clever strategy, and it would only work in open societies. So long as we leave these kind of anonymous mechanisms in place for the transfer of money, so long as we leave so long as we have a kind of a very deep political polarization and kind of unhealthy political systems and that sort of thing, we leave ourselves vulnerable to Russian influence. And, I always try to emphasize that Russia does not create the cleavages in our societies. It exacerbates them. It takes advantage of them. And it's up to us to recognize them and try to heal them as best we can. Try to reduce those vulnerabilities as best we can. In reality, democracy will always have cleavages, but it's up to us to build our defenses as robustly as possible.
All right. In this respect, do we need a significant improvement of the existing security mechanism in Europe?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that's been demonstrated over and over and over again with, say, kind of the failure of the UN Security Council in this and the failure of international institutions to respond to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I always try to point out that, we were ready to lose, right? Our strategy was to evacuate Zelensky, to fall back to the next line, essentially, and buckle down and, pray that Russia doesn't invade Romania or Poland or, God forbid, all the way through Romania to Bulgaria, right? I don't think we recognized the amount of danger that we were in. We barely avoided a world war situation, and only because the Ukrainians turned out to be much more heroic and courageous than anybody ever thought. So we can't rely on luck. We need a serious institutional architecture that will deter Russia. And right now, Russia is completely undeterred. I think they've been a little bit deterred by Ukrainian resolve and our support for Ukraine. But the reality is they embarked upon this, attempt to overturn the European security architecture and really the world security architecture because we'd given them every indication that we would not respond. And I think they were right about that ultimately, because again, our immediate response was to evacuate, to run away, and that just can't be the case. We have to be able to be strong with Russia. We can't let them get away with this sort of thing. And we've been letting them get away with it for decades. We let them get away with it in Georgia. We let them get away with it in Syria. We let them get away with it the first time in Ukraine. We've been letting them get away with assassinations around the world. We've been letting them get away with, as we've discussed, corruption and disinformation around the world. Russia needs to learn that they can't get away with it, that this will not be tolerated. And I think they're just learning that now, and again, only because of the Ukrainians. But the security architecture has not caught up. Like an immediate important thing is with the upcoming summit in Vilnius, that Ukraine be given concrete and specific steps for joining NATO. Ukraine must eventually join NATO. That is, I mean, not just eventually, but as soon as possible, join NATO. I mean, ideally, immediately, if they could, if we can find a way to agreement. But at the very least, they must be given concrete and specific steps. And I think that's the immediate first step to healing what is really an ailing security architecture on all fronts: economic, military, human rights, everything.
I agree with you. I could not agree more with you, and I really hope for significant improvement, because this fragile balance sometimes plays a bad joke on some countries. For example, right now the Polish protests, I could see points on both sides. At the same time, I read very carefully one important point proposed by the new lawmakers in Poland, and this law wants to actually investigate the period between 2007 until 2022, the beginning of the large-scale, full-scale war against Ukraine. And basically they want to search for collaborators inside Poland. And now certain elements of the opposition parties are trying to say that this is too totalitarian or authoritarian, etc. But according to my modest opinion, what the lawmakers are trying to do is actually an important step which has to be taken in many countries all over the world, not just in Poland, but also in our country, in Eastern Europe, and perhaps also in the Western Europe and also in the United States, because over the past 2 decades we have seen so many examples of supporting Russian propaganda. I don't see anything wrong with proposing such laws in the view of light of this improvement of the security situation. What do you think about?
I would say, especially in Western Europe and the United States. I mean, one thing, who was really taken for a ride by all this was Western Europe and the United States. I mean, it's Nord Stream 2, right? I mean, it's François Fillon, former Prime Minister of France, who went to work for Russia. It's Gerhard Schroeder, who's still working for Russia. It's
exactly.
Karen Kneißl in Austria, who went to work for Russia. I mean, it's all over, and that's the top line. I mean, but what about the next level, even the middle level? There's even more people. There's endless mercenary lobbying firms and consulting firms and advisory firms and so on and so forth that were doing nothing but Russia's bidding in exchange for what was really, in comparison to the money that the oligarchs wield, a very small amount of cash. At most $500,000 a year to buy a very powerful former official. So we have to be very, very honest with ourselves in the West and how much we've been taken for a ride and how much our laws have lagged behind. And in fact, I've highlighted before, I think it's time we have a little humility. We need to be listening to Central and Eastern Europeans much more than we did. I mean, it was actually the Central and Eastern Europeans that were sounding the alarm bells for decades before this happened. I mean, saying this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And I mean, for those that really weren't listening and not maybe even had cynical reasons not to listen because they were taking some money, these were dismissed as alarmist Eastern Europeans. They're traumatized by being under communism. And yeah, they would be traumatized because it was an awful situation, but they know Russia better than anybody, and we really need to listen to them. Look, I think when it comes to fixing our legal and financial and security frameworks after 30 years of failure, it's a huge challenge. I mean, and there is a challenge with being able to do it the right way. Okay, so we need to ensure that whatever we do, we are maintaining basic rights and fundamental freedoms and preserving our democracies. We never want to become them in order to defeat them. This has particularly been a major part of the discussion when it comes to, say, China, right? I mean, so we in the United States are also very concerned about Chinese influence, which in the U.S. context, Russian influence pales in comparison to Chinese influence. Chinese companies are extremely active in the United States. A lot of former officials lobby for Chinese companies, and of course, Chinese companies are just they're just arms of the Chinese Communist Party. There's no such thing as a private sector in China. I mean, at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party is behind every single one of these entities and can tell them what to do whenever they need to, and so on and so forth. So we've been doing a lot of discussions about this, both in the Russian and Chinese context. And I mean, the big challenge is, how do we set up laws? How do we set up appropriate laws that prevent foreign influence while also maintaining, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all the major basics that, property rights, all the major basics that underpin the society we're fighting for, because that's what makes our society valuable in the first place. So it's a hard discussion. I mean, this stuff is hard to do right, and there will be times when people propose things that maybe go over the line, and then they need to be rejiggered or shot down entirely. But we always need to keep in mind that we need to protect ourselves. One, two, we need to ensure that this protection doesn't end up being counterproductive in some way. So this is always kind of the tightrope we're walking. But obviously, we haven't done nearly enough, and it's time for people to start proposing bold action. And then it can be criticized and it can be taken apart, but people need to start proposing bold action to keep this influence out of our systems.
Great. Speaking of bold actions and more decisive actions, do you think the United States should engage more decisively in supporting democracy in Bulgaria?
I mean, so engaging with Bulgaria, supporting democracy in Bulgaria. I mean, Bulgaria is a major NATO ally. I mean, we need to be doing a whole lot more in Bulgaria. I mean, that's why I was in Sofia, and it was great. I can't wait to get back. I mean, we'd love to do more with Bulgaria. I think the Black Sea in particular is becoming, and really should have been. I mean, again, we're chasing after the things kind of we did wrong. I think there is a recognition in Washington that, wow, we really should have been paying closer attention to the Black Sea region. We really should have had a Black Sea strategy. We really should have understood what was going on here. We kind of dropped the ball in this area, and now it's time to, pick it back up again, because we got this mulligan from the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are in effect saving the world right now, and now we need to fix it so that we're not totally reliant upon, luck of the draw and just, hoping that you get a people that's going to fight back against the Russians when they make their next move in the region. Exactly,
and the good news is that right now there is a new United States initiative for development of the Black Sea region. What are the main activities proposed under this quite needed program?
So I think at this point we are still waiting for the National Security Council to come out with its Black Sea strategy, but you're absolutely right. It's totally expected. Senator Shaheen in the Senate has introduced a bill that would that provides the expectations for this strategy, as well as, kind of says a little bit, hurry up, get it done. At this point, I mean, the bill's there, and it could pass if there is further delay in the publication of the strategy. I mean, it is of course complicated. It's a complicated region. I mean, it is a tough strategy to build, and it's very reliant upon, allies like Turkey, which, are complicated allies, to say the least. That said, they're allies, so you have to be thinking about this kind of thing. When it comes down to the substance of the strategy, I think the main thrust, as always, will be military security. Look, there's a hot war, the biggest hot war in Europe since World War II, interstate war going on in the Black Sea region. We have to be really realistic about, what this means. It means we need greater NATO presence in the region. We need to build up, the military know-how. So all of this stuff, I think, is going to be the key thrust. That said, countering disinformation, what you do, counter propaganda, thinking in terms of how do we get our narrative across more effectively in a region where it's actually been kind of weak. I mean, it kind of struck me when I was in Bulgaria the extent to which kind of the Western narrative, the U.S. narrative, is very contested, I would say. And it really, to me, it shouldn't be that contested in an EU or NATO state. So we really have to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong here? How can we be more effective, and how can we kind of get our point across? Because I have no doubt that we have the truth on our side. We're the free society. We're the ones that want nothing more than for there to be a strong, sovereign Bulgaria. It's Russia that wants to have everybody as their puppet states and come and kiss Moscow's ring and stuff like that. So we clearly need to do a better job getting those points across. And I think that will be part of the strategy. And then finally, there will be, of course, an economic pillar. How do we, further integrate the Black Sea into these really powerful markets that we could integrate them into? How can we encourage economic prosperity? And some of this will also come down to, of course, finding ways to work with the EU, because, Bulgaria, Romania, are part of the EU, and in that case, you're going to be part of the same trading bloc. So we have to be thinking about that as well.
Absolutely. Actually, speaking of the EU policy, there was a significant change after the United States kind of pulled back out of Bulgaria like 2 decades ago. At that time, there were a lot of United States programs that were funding independent, non-governmental and other organizations in Bulgaria directly. After we joined the European Union, the European funds, they actually go through the government, through the different departments, and this means a lot of dependence on politics. And in a country like Bulgaria and similar countries to Bulgaria, sometimes this means corruption, sometimes this means clientelism, and a lot of good ideas actually proposed by the EU are not implemented in practice in this way. So over the last 2 decades, this combined with a strong Putinist propaganda here created the situation which you probably saw when you visited Sofia. You see, pro-Russian parties are on the rise in Bulgaria right now. They are mushrooming. America is portrayed as the ultimate evil. Russian diplomats here openly express their support to their parties in Bulgaria. Is it about high time for the United States to speak openly here? There is nothing much to lose already.
Well, yes. And I think it's actually high time for the USA to speak openly everywhere. I think that we've done a very poor job understanding the information war we're in. We don't even refer to it for the most part as an information war. I think that, we've become extremely risk averse. There's kind of a feeling all over the world, in Washington, that all over the world, democracy is very fragile. And this has led to kind of this hands-off sort of thing, like, okay, well, if we touch it, we're going to break it. But in reality, it's the opposite. When things are fragile, you have to be really bold. You have to get in there. You have to start fighting because your adversaries are going to try to break it, and they're going to do a very good job of it. And that's kind of what you see. Because we have this kind of perspective of, oh no, we could make a mistake or something could go wrong. And we have to get out of this mindset. We have to start to understand that kind of the boldest course is actually the safest course. One may not think that intuitively, but it really is. You have to start taking bold action, and you have to start engaging strongly in the info war. I've sort of, all these kind of fun proposals I've had, but I would give every single U.S. employee a Twitter account. I would say, go start speaking openly. We need to get out of this, really poor notion of every official tweet we make needs to go through 20 layers of approval, and every press release needs to be boiled down to some bland, mushy nothing. We need to really get in the fray. I couldn't agree with you more, and know and have confidence in the fact that what we are selling what we are coming to these countries with is worth having. I mean, this is the only society worth having. This is the free society. So I think if we really made the pitch, if we made the sale, we'd find that more and more in Bulgarians, but people around the world would be like, okay, yeah, no, this makes sense.
Absolutely. Considering the power struggle in Russia right now, and we see the obvious military actions by this volunteer Republican Army, the Freedom Legions, etc. Is it possible to see change of Putin, but not of the system of the imperialistic way of thinking? I remember once upon a time, Putin was portrayed in front of the world from those power circles who decided that he would be the next president of Russia after Yeltsin. He was being portrayed as a Democrat versus an old sage communist. His name was Yuganov. And this power game, with which Russian special services actually outwitted the West, that's how they installed Putin. That's how we came into the situation we see right now. So my question is, is it possible that the new Putin, after the old Putin, will create a new network of politicians, businessmen, and media in Eastern Europe?
It is extremely possible. And I think that this is kind of the revelation that some of us have had. Some of us are still waiting to have in Washington. But I think that this is kind of like the discussion we're in right now, is that, look, we can never reintegrate Russia in its current form. We need to recognize that, this has been going on for effectively centuries. You're exactly right that it's the same core Russian imperial identity that it's been for a long, long time, that this war is imperial in nature. I mean, we really tried to do everything we could in the post-Cold War context to integrate Russia into the international system, to give them the benefit of the doubt. There was the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We put them in the freaking G7, for God's sake. We integrated them into every single international organization there was, massive aid packages. We did everything we could, and they just came back and spat in our face, constantly. And we need to recognize, what Russia is. And it's a very hard recognition, I think, for Americans, not just because of the corruption, not just because of the disinformation, but also because Americans, we don't want to believe that there can be kind of like this effectively deeply imperial country. We want every dictatorship to essentially be kind of like, a free people in waiting. It's kind of like there's a dictator and he's holding the people hostage. But that's just really not what Russia is. I mean, we don't see protests in Russia. We don't see, a mass uprising against this horrific genocidal war that, in all honesty, killed a lot of Russians too. And, even if that was all you cared about, there should be some kind of uprising. But that there's not, because at the end of the day, there's still kind of this, well, I mean, we do need to get Ukraine back, so it's kind of like we need to keep Russia isolated. The kind of option of there being a new authoritarian style leader or someone that promises to be a liberal or whatever at the top of Russia, that will not work. Then we're just falling right into the same trap. I've said again and again and again, we need demilitarization, denuclearization, and decolonization. So we need Russia to really become a proper nation state at the end of the day before they can be reintegrated. And until that point, we have to handle them like Iran or North Korea or Cuba or something like that. We have to isolate them deeply and keep them isolated. And whether it's Putin for the next 10 years or whether it ends up being, I don't know, I mean, Prigozhin certainly seems like he's making a play for Russian leadership. But I mean, whoever it's going to be, we need to keep them isolated until they agree to those, until they agree and demonstrate commitment to those three conditions.
Absolutely. I hope the decision makers in Washington will listen to people like you. What is the connection between Russian propaganda, mass sports, culture, art, and entertainment business?
Oh, I mean, it's everything. I mean, the Russians try to get their name on. I mean, there's a freaking Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, the Blavatnik wing of the Victoria and Albert Museum. I mean, this is, the Vexelbergs tried to get their name on a bunch of MIT stuff. And thank God we'd reached a point at which it just became kind of unacceptable to take that money. But this is all part of the reputation laundering scheme. It's all part of, this kind of quote unquote Russian culture phenomenon where they come in with money. They try to get their names on stuff. They try to launder the reputation of Russia from what it really is, which is a brutal imperialistic state based on repression and murder, as we see in Ukraine, and really you see also domestically. I mean, again, quote unquote domestically, because obviously Russia has internal colonies. It is an internal empire. And what they want you to see of Russia, which is kind of, well, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, ballet, whatever, So we have to be very cautious of this. We have to recognize Russia for what it is. That's all I'm advocating, is to be realistic toward Russia.
Absolutely. Not to forget that once upon a time Hitler was saying how great is Wagner, for example, the composer. Probably it's not a coincidence that now this Russian mercenary group is called Wagner. I mean, this is the same way of totalitarian thinking and using culture as a weapon. So I really like what you have been doing, and I would like to congratulate you once more for your initiatives in discovering this correlation between mass sports and Russian propaganda, and all important things which you have been doing over the years, showing the world how even sport could be used as a weapon. Here we move to our final question. In the present era of Russian aggression against Ukraine and the free world, could we say that conformists are as bad as open Putinists?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could. I mean, I think that it's kind of like I don't know. I mean, you really need kind of a figure that's going to come up and kind of try to transform the Russian identity. I think that the bottom line is, what is a conformist? I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, even Russians living abroad are, for the most part, very nationalistic. They find themselves being very pro-war, because I think there's a very, or if they're not pro-war, then they kind of just shut up. And yes, that's also very bad. And even if they say no war or whatever, they certainly don't say Ukraine should win the war or something like this. So I think that part of the core problem here is one of Russian identity. It's like, what does it mean to be Russian? And I think for the most part, for Russians, it means you get to dominate your region. You get to have your colonies. You get to invade your neighbors. You get to bully whoever you want. And that's part of what it is to be Russian. Perhaps it is the prevailing thing to be Russian. So what you need now is, some kind of a movement, or some kind of a talk, or some kind of a intellectual idea of, what would it be to have a Russian state within proper borders? What does it mean to be Russian that doesn't include domination? Do you even have to change the name? Is it called Moscovian? Are they called Muscovites? Whatever. But you need some kind of idea that gets beyond the identity. I hope that kind of answers your question. I mean, I obviously I think at the end of the day, like open Putinists or genocidaires are always worse. But are the silent bad? Like, yes, like they're clearly taking Russia's side, like calling for neutrality or calling for an end to the conflict that is not Ukrainian victory. Exactly. is Russian victory. You're taking Russia's side without a doubt.
Absolutely. Mr. Paul Massaro, thank you so much for this interview, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And I hope we'll have the chance in the near future to continue this very interesting conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you next time.
Yep. This has been my exclusive interview with Paul Massaro from the United States Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. I'm looking forward to continuing interviewing global security experts from all over the world for you. I thank you all for being together tonight with Visible and Invisible Counter-Propaganda with me, SVET DI-NAHUM. I'll see you next time. Until then, you may like, follow and share our Facebook page, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or support us on Patreon. Thank you all. Stay cool as usual. Look for the truth. Have a good one. Thank you.